Mel Gibson walked onto the set knowing exactly what this was. It wasn't an interview, it was an ambush. The bright studio lights, the carefully curated audience, the smirking host, everything was designed for one purpose: to trap him. Matt Dixon had built his career on tearing down guests who didn't fit the Hollywood narrative, and tonight was supposed to be no different. He had his talking points, his rehearsed smirks, his baited questions ready to push Gibson into a corner. But there was one problem. Mel Gibson wasn't the easy target they thought he was. He had seen men like Dixon before, comfortable in their control, certain of their ability to twist words and shape perceptions. But what happens when the script flips? When the man they tried to destroy refuses to play along? As the cameras rolled and the first question was asked, one thing became clear. This wouldn't go the way Dixon had planned, and by the end of the night, only one of them would walk away with their reputation intact. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The studio lights burned hot, too hot for comfort. The air was thick with tension, a kind of unspoken electricity that crackled between the cameras, the crew, and the man sitting across from me. I could feel it before a single word was spoken. The host, Matt Dixon, wore his signature smirk, the kind that had been polished over years of gutting his guests on live television. He thought he was in control. He thought I didn't see the trap he had set. But I did, and I was already planning how to spring it back on him. The countdown began. The producer held up fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red light on the camera blinked alive. Dixon straightened in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Tonight," he began, his voice smooth as glass but just as fragile, "we have a very special guest. A man who has sparked controversy, debate, and more than his fair share of headlines. A Hollywood legend, but also, some would say, a relic of the past." He paused just long enough to let the words sink in, for the audience to catch the scent of blood in the water. Mel Gibson. I didn't react. Not yet. I just sat there, hands resting loosely on my lap, my face unreadable. I'd done this before. I knew the game. Dixon leaned in slightly, as if we were about to have an intimate conversation instead of a performance for millions. "Mel, thanks for being here," he said, the smile on his face just a shade too tight. I tilted my head just a fraction, giving him nothing. "Pleasure's mine." He let the silence stretch, waiting for me to fill it. I didn't. That was his first mistake, expecting me to play by his rules. He recovered quickly, flashing his practiced grin. "Now, Mel, you've had one of the most remarkable careers in Hollywood. An Oscar-winning director, a box office juggernaut, a household name. But let's be honest, you've also been one of its most controversial figures. There are people who say you represent an era of Hollywood that should be left behind, that the world has moved on, and maybe you haven't." There it was, the opening shot. Carefully worded, dripping in false politeness, but sharp enough to cut if I let it. I let out a slow breath through my nose, my expression unchanged. "That's an interesting way to start." Dixon chuckled, a low, calculated sound. "I just think it's worth discussing. People have opinions and they're not afraid to share them. Some admire you, others, well, they see you as a man who refuses to change with the times. Would you say that's fair?" I studied him for a beat, not answering right away. He wanted me to react, to get defensive, to give him something he could twist. But I wasn't going to hand him a single damn thing. Instead, I did what he wasn't expecting. I smiled. Just a small, knowing smile. "Fair," I repeated, rolling the word on my tongue like I was tasting it. "Depends on who gets to decide what fair means." His eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. He wasn't expecting me to push back this early. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "let's talk about that." I adjusted my posture slightly, the way a fighter does before the first punch is thrown. The studio was a manufactured battlefield, dressed up as a place for conversation. Bright lights overhead cast everything in an artificial glow, the kind that made sweat bead at the hairline if you weren't used to it. The audience, a carefully selected mix of believers and skeptics, sat in a semicircle around us, their faces half illuminated, half shadowed. They weren't just here to listen, they were here to react, to be a part of the spectacle, to gasp, laugh, murmur, to let the world know, even without speaking, which side they were on. Every movement, every glance, every breath I took was being watched, analyzed, dissected in real time. Matt Dixon knew how to work this room. He had spent years mastering the rhythm of televised combat. His posture was calculated, slightly forward, engaged but not aggressive. His expression carried the perfect balance of warmth and skepticism, just enough charm to lull a guest into thinking they were in friendly territory before the knives came out. He wore a navy suit, tailored but not too flashy, a crisp white shirt, an expensive watch peeking out from beneath the cuff, subtle indicators of power, of status. He wasn't just a journalist. He was the voice of a particular kind of modern media, the kind that didn't just report, but shaped the narrative itself. His reputation preceded him. He had built a career on turning interviews into interrogations, on exposing the cracks in public figures and widening them into fault lines that swallowed reputations whole. Politicians, actors, CEOs, he had taken them all down in one way or another, some through clever wordplay, some through outright ambush. He thrived on the discomfort of others, on the power of the well-placed pause, the slow, deliberate smile that signaled he knew something his guest didn't. That was his signature move, the moment when he shifted from host to executioner. He had done it so many times before. But tonight was different. I could see it in his eyes, just a flicker of something behind the well-rehearsed confidence, a sliver of doubt. Maybe it was because I wasn't fidgeting like most of his guests did. Maybe it was because I wasn't forcing a polite grin or shifting in my seat. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he was sitting across from someone who had nothing to lose. I leaned back slightly in my chair, resting an arm on the armrest, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. I wasn't here to win an argument. I wasn't here to defend myself against pre-planned accusations disguised as innocent questions. I was here to expose the game for what it was. A faint murmur rippled through the audience as Dixon adjusted his tie. A subtle movement, but enough to let me know he was recalibrating. He needed to regain control. He glanced toward the cameras, his cue to remind the viewers at home that he was still the one running this show. "Mel," he said, flashing that signature smirk, "I want to start with something simple." He gestured vaguely with his hand as if what he was about to ask was just casual conversation. "What do you think people get wrong about you?" The question was designed to do two things: make me defensive and put me in a position where I had to prove something. I wasn't going to take the bait. I exhaled through my nose, slow and deliberate. "That depends on who's doing the getting wrong," I said, tilting my head slightly. "People have opinions. That's nothing new. The real question is, whose opinion matters?" Dixon let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Come on, Mel, you know what I mean. The public perception, your history, your views." Ah, there it was. A careful step toward the real reason I was here. Not to talk about my career, not to discuss filmmaking or storytelling, but to be dissected, analyzed, and if possible, cornered. I glanced toward the audience, scanning their faces. Some were leaning forward, waiting for me to stumble, waiting for the moment when Dixon would strike and I would have to scramble to recover. Others, older, sharper, less easily swayed, watched with narrowed eyes, not buying into the theater of it all. And then, there were the cameras. Dozens of them, lining the edges of the set, their red lights blinking like mechanical eyes, recording everything, ready to take a single sentence out of context and turn it into a headline before the interview was even over. I turned back to Dixon. He was watching me carefully now, sensing that I wasn't following the script he had expected. He wanted an argument. He wanted a moment. I wasn't going to give it to him, not yet. "What do I think people get wrong about me?" I repeated, as if I were truly considering it for the first time. I let the question linger in the air just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. Then I smiled, just barely. I think people mistake silence for surrender." The words hung between us. Dixon's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, so quick most wouldn't have caught it, but I did. And I knew from that moment on this wasn't going to be the interview he had planned. Dixon shifted in his chair, rolling his shoulders back as if settling in for a long conversation. But I knew better. He wasn't getting comfortable. He was preparing for the first real push, the moment when the polite facade would start to crack, when the claws would come out under the guise of just asking questions. The audience could sense it too. There was a certain shift in the air, the kind that happens right before a storm. "I have to ask, Mel," Dixon began, his voice smooth but laced with something sharper. "Do you ever look back and think, maybe I should have handled things differently?" He smiled, like it was a friendly question, like he was offering me an opportunity for reflection. It was bait, plain and simple. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering it, but I didn't blink. Handled what differently? Dixon's smile widened just a fraction. He liked that answer. It gave him an opening. "Well," he said, drawing out the word like he was easing into something casual, "there's been a lot of controversy surrounding you over the years. Certain comments, certain moments. Some would say they defined your career just as much as your films. Some. That was always the trick. Hide behind the vague collective. Some would say, many believe. People think." It gave him the freedom to say whatever he wanted without taking responsibility for it. I exhaled through my nose, slow and controlled. "It's interesting," I said, "how often people like to rewrite someone's career based on headlines instead of work." Dixon chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Come on, Mel, you know I respect your work. That's not the point." "Then what is?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "The point," Dixon said, leaning forward just slightly, "is that culture has changed. Hollywood has changed. People have changed. And yet, some people," he gestured loosely in my direction, "seem to think they don't have to." There it was, the first real strike. I studied him for a beat, letting the words settle, letting the audience feel the weight of them before I responded. "I think the real question is whether change is always progress," I said. "Not all change is good. Not all movements move forward." Dixon's eyes flickered. He saw where I was going, and he didn't like it. "So, you think the world is moving in the wrong direction?" "I think the world is moving fast," I said. "And I think a lot of people are afraid to stop and ask where it's taking them." A murmur rippled through the audience. Dixon caught it too, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He needed to reframe, to push harder. "Mel," he said, forcing a light chuckle, "you've always had strong opinions, but don't you think part of the problem is that you don't always seem to care how they come across?" "Who decides that?" I asked. "What do you mean?" I gestured slightly, not to the audience, not to the cameras, but to the space between us. Who gets to decide what's acceptable and what isn't? You? The people on Twitter? A boardroom full of executives? Dixon's smirk faltered, just slightly. "I think," he said carefully, "that society decides. And society has spoken on a lot of issues." Society or the loudest voices in the room? The audience shifted. Dixon noticed. His fingers curled slightly around his cue cards, but he didn't look down at them. He knew this was a moment that had to be handled carefully. "I don't think it's about volume," he said, keeping his tone controlled. "It's about accountability. When public figures say things that are offensive, when they cross a line, there are consequences. That's not suppression, that's responsibility." I nodded slowly, as if considering it, but I wasn't playing his game. "And yet," I said, "it's funny how responsibility only seems to go one way." Dixon frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, "that the same people who demand accountability never seem to apply it to themselves. They decide who gets to speak, what can be said, and when someone steps outside the line they call it justice when they silence them. But when they do the same thing, it's just an opinion." Dixon let out another soft chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. Mel, you're not seriously suggesting that you've been silenced, are you? You're sitting here right now on one of the biggest talk shows in the country. Doesn't seem like you've been canceled to me. I smiled slightly. You think being canceled is about whether or not I'm sitting in this chair? I gestured toward the cameras. This isn't about me. It never was. It's about the bigger picture, about how easy it is to erase someone the moment they don't fall in line. Dixon inhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting his posture. He wasn't going to let me take control, not yet. Mel, with all due respect, no one erased you. You still make films, you still have a platform, but when people bring up your past, when they ask you to address things you've said, that's not erasure, that's just people wanting you to be accountable. I nodded slightly, but my expression didn't change. And who holds them accountable? He blinked. The people who control these conversations, I continued, the ones who get to decide what's acceptable today and unacceptable tomorrow. They change the rules when it suits them, and they never apply them to themselves. Dixon opened his mouth, but he hesitated just long enough for me to see it. That was his second mistake. I leaned forward slightly, mirroring his earlier posture. You've built a career on asking tough questions, Matt, but let me ask you one. If I had said 10 years ago the exact things people say now, if I had agreed with them before it became popular, would they have tried to cancel me? Or would they have called me ahead of my time? Silence. The audience was no longer just watching, they were waiting. Dixon wet his lips slightly. Mel, I think. I raised a hand, just a fraction, stopping him without force, without aggression. You don't have to answer that, I said, voice steady. I think we both know the truth. Dixon exhaled, his jaw tightening for just a moment before he forced another smile. Well, he said, trying to regain his footing, we still have a lot to talk about. I sat back, watching him. Yes, we did. Dixon let out a slow breath through his nose, rolling his shoulders back like he was resetting himself. He had lost the last exchange, and he knew it. The audience knew it too. There was a shift in the room now, an imbalance in the dynamic. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to be leading the conversation, steering it wherever he wanted. But I had put him on the defensive, even if he wouldn't admit it. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He forced a smile, tightening his grip on the cue cards in front of him. All right, Mel, he said, his voice still smooth, still controlled, but there was an edge to it now. Let's take a step back. You've had a long career. You've seen Hollywood change. Some would argue that it's evolved for the better, that it's more inclusive, more responsible, more aware. But others, yourself included from what I can tell, seem to think it's heading in the wrong direction. So let's be clear. What exactly is it that you take issue with? It was a challenge, one meant to force me into a corner. If I said Hollywood had changed for the worse, I would sound bitter, out of touch, like a man clinging to the past. If I said it had changed for the better, I'd be conceding. Either way, he thought he had me. I tilted my head slightly, watching him. I think Hollywood has always been the same, I said, letting the word sit for a moment. It just pretends to be different now. Dixon's expression didn't change, but the corners of his mouth twitched, just for a second. He knew I wasn't going to make this easy. What do you mean by that? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. It's not about progress, Matt. It never was. It's about control. The same people who used to decide who got to speak are still deciding it now. They just wear a different mask. A murmur ran through the audience. Dixon sat up a little straighter. Are you saying that holding people accountable is the same thing as control? I smirked. Depends. Who's holding them accountable? He opened his mouth, but I kept going before he could interrupt. See, it's easy to say you're standing up for something when the whole industry backs you. It's easy to call yourself brave when you're repeating the same thing everyone else is saying. The real question is, what happens when someone... Dixon's smile was thin now, stretched too tight. He shook his head, chuckling softly like he was trying to stay amused. Mel, come on. No one's saying people can't have their opinions. I raised an eyebrow. Aren't they? He leaned forward slightly, tapping his cue cards against the desk, buying himself a second to think. You know, he said, his voice lowering just enough to sound almost sympathetic, It kind of sounds like you see yourself as a victim in all of this." There it was. The playbook. When logic didn't work, shift the narrative. Make the other person sound defensive. Make them sound like they're whining. I smiled, just a little. "I've been in this industry long enough to know that playing the victim is one of the best ways to get ahead," I said. "You should know it's half your job." The audience gasped. Dixon blinked, caught off guard, but only for a second. He forced another chuckle, but it didn't quite land. "All right, that's a good one," he said, shaking his head. "But let's get serious here. You've had your controversies, we all know that. And yet, here you are, still making films, still being invited onto shows like this. Doesn't that prove that all this talk about being silenced is a little exaggerated?" I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it. That's the trick though, isn't it? You don't have to disappear someone completely, you just have to make sure they know where the line is. Dixon's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He leaned back, folding his arms, shifting tactics again. "All right," he said, his voice still measured but firmer now. "Let's talk about those lines. Do you think there should be any? Do you think there's anything that just shouldn't be said?" I let the question sit between us. The audience held its breath. "That depends," I said finally. "Is it about protecting people? Or is it about making sure they only hear what you want them to hear?" Dixon exhaled sharply, adjusting his tie. He wasn't smiling anymore, he was recalibrating, trying to figure out where to go next. I could see it in his eyes. He thought he could handle this, thought it would go like every other interview he had done, but now he wasn't sure. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough that the room seemed to shrink around us. "You know, Matt," I said, "I don't think you actually believe half of what you're saying." His eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me?" I shrugged. "I think you say what you have to say because you know what happens if you don't." A beat of silence. The audience murmured again. Dixon's nostrils flared, but he forced himself to stay composed. "And what exactly do you think happens?" I sat back, crossing one leg over the other. "I think the people who talk the loudest about justice and fairness are usually the ones most afraid of losing their seat at the table. And I think, deep down, you know that as well as anyone." Dixon stared at me for a moment, his fingers tightening around the cue cards. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had something to say, but he wasn't sure if it would land. That was his third mistake. I had him. Dixon wet his lips, shifting in his chair just slightly, a flicker of something uneasy passing through his expression. He knew he was losing ground. The audience could feel it too. The tension in the studio had thickened into something almost physical, something that made people sit forward in their seats without realizing it. This wasn't just another segment anymore. This wasn't going the way it was supposed to. He let out a breath through his nose, rolling his shoulders back as if resetting himself. "You know, Mel," he said, his voice lighter now, an attempt to take control again, "I think there's something we haven't touched on yet. Something that's at the heart of all this." I tilted my head slightly, watching him, waiting. He licked his lips again, a tell. "Isn't it possible," he said, drawing out the words carefully, "that maybe, just maybe, the real issue here isn't control or censorship or cancel culture, but accountability? Maybe the problem isn't that people are trying to silence you. Maybe it's just that they don't want to listen anymore." A murmur rippled through the audience. Dixon saw his opening and pressed forward, leaning in slightly. "I mean, let's be honest," he continued, his tone sharpening just enough. "The things that got you into trouble weren't exactly misunderstandings, were they? They were things you actually said, things you actually did. And isn't it fair for people to react to that? Isn't that just the world working the way it's supposed to?" The way he said it, so measured, so calculated, it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. I let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of the moment, watching Dixon's expression as he waited for me to stumble, for me to say something he could twist. And then I smiled, just a small, knowing smile. "You really believe that, don't you?" I said. Dixon's brow furrowed slightly. "Believe what?" "That this is about fairness," I said. That what's happening to people isn't about power or narratives or keeping certain voices in line, that it's just natural consequences, that the world is just correcting itself. His lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before he shook his head. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said," I replied. Dixon inhaled, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Another tell. He didn't like where this was going. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make the room feel smaller, more intimate. "Tell me something, Matt. Let's say, hypothetically, that 10 years ago you sat where I'm sitting now. That you said something totally normal back then, something no one even batted an eye at. But the world changed, and suddenly what you said was considered unacceptable. And now someone like you, someone in your chair, is looking at you saying, 'Well, Matt, isn't it fair for people to react to that?'" Dixon blinked. The audience was dead silent. I let the words settle in, let him feel them. "Would you still think it was fair?" I asked. "Would you still say, 'That's just accountability'? Or would you start to wonder who gets to decide when the rules change? Who gets to decide what's okay today and unforgivable tomorrow?" Dixon's jaw tightened just slightly. "That's not the same thing, isn't it?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. I sat back, watching him. "See, that's the thing, Matt. It's always easy to talk about accountability when you're the one holding the microphone. But what happens when they turn it on you? What happens when you say the wrong thing? When you step outside the line? When suddenly it's your name trending for the wrong reasons? Do you think they'll care about your intentions? About the context? Or do you think they'll just go for the kill because it's easy, because it's entertaining, because it's what they do?" Dixon swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. I shook my head. "You think you're in control because you're the one asking the questions. But the truth is, the second you say something they don't like, they'll come for you just as fast as they've come for everyone else. And you'll realize what I already know." He exhaled sharply. "And what's that?" I held his gaze. "That there is no forgiveness," I said. "Only obedience." Dead silence. Dixon shifted back in his chair, glancing toward the audience, toward the cameras, toward the crew. For the first time, he looked unsure, like he wasn't certain how this was going to end, like he wasn't certain he was still in control. Dixon's jaw was tight now, his fingers flexed slightly against the stack of cue cards in front of him, but he didn't look at them. He knew there was nothing there that could save him. The script was gone, the control slipping further out of his grasp with each second of silence that stretched between us. The audience wasn't shifting uncomfortably anymore. They were watching, waiting. And not for him. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair, watching him the way a man watches a card player who just realized he's been dealt a losing hand. Dixon had spent years perfecting his technique, whittling down his guests with carefully curated questions, guiding them into corners they couldn't escape from. But the problem with knowing how to corner people is that you assume they'll play along. He tried to force a chuckle, shaking his head like this was still a game he could win. "You've got quite a perspective, Mel," he said, his voice measured, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "But let's be honest. If you really believed all of this, if you really thought the world was as controlled as you say, then why are you still here? Why are you still making movies? Why are you still sitting in this chair?" It was a desperate move, the last lifeline of a man trying to remind the audience that I wasn't the underdog, that I wasn't someone being silenced, that I was still, by all accounts, successful. That was supposed to mean something. That was supposed to prove him right. I smiled, just slightly. Because the only thing they hate more than people who refuse to fall in line— I let the words hang for a moment, watching his eyes— are the ones they tried to erase, but couldn't. A murmur ran through the audience, low at first, then building. Dixon opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time all night, I didn't let him. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk between us. "I'm not here because they want me here," I said. "I'm here because no matter how many times they've tried to bury me, the people keep digging me back up." I gestured slightly, not to the cameras, not to Dixon, but to the room itself. That's the thing about control. It only works if people believe in it, if they trust it, if they accept that the people setting the rules are the ones who deserve to be making them. But what happens when people stop believing? What happens when they start asking why the rules only seem to go one way? Dixon's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I shook my head. They told people that questioning things was dangerous, that having your own thoughts could get you labeled, blacklisted, thrown out, and for a long time that worked. People were afraid. I let the pause stretch, let the weight of it settle, but they pushed too far. They got too greedy, and now people are starting to realize what I realized a long time ago. Dixon swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. And what's that? I smiled again, this time a little wider, that the only power they have is the power people give them. Silence, thick and heavy. The audience was no longer just spectators, they were witnesses. Witnesses to something they hadn't expected, something they hadn't seen before. This wasn't an interview anymore, this was a reckoning. Dixon shifted, his jaw tightening, but it was over. He knew it, I knew it, the audience knew it. He could try to change the subject, try to laugh it off, try to wrap it up neatly so that the damage wasn't permanent, but it was too late. The internet had already clipped this moment. It had already started spreading. He would leave this room, and by the time he checked his phone, he would see it everywhere. I sat back, folding my hands loosely in my lap. "Anything else, Matt?" He forced a breath through his nose, glancing briefly toward the producers behind the cameras. I could tell they were scrambling, panicked, trying to figure out how to salvage this, trying to find an angle that would make this look like something other than what it was. But there was nothing they could do. Dixon forced a smile, but it wasn't real. It was tight, uneasy. He nodded once, a shallow movement. "I think we've covered a lot." I nodded back, but only once. The show wasn't over yet, but Dixon was. The interview had barely ended when the first clip started flooding social media. It wasn't just a moment, it was the moment. The one that would be replayed, dissected, turned into headlines before the cameras had even cooled. Someone in the audience had already uploaded a snippet before I'd even stepped off set, and from there, it spread like wildfire. Twitter, or whatever they were calling it now, was the first to erupt. Short clips of the exchange between me and Dixon flooded timelines, each one framed with captions like, "Mel Gibson just ended this man's career," and "Dixon tried to trap him and got dismantled instead." Some of them cut right to the moment he lost control. Others stitched together the slow collapse of his composure, turning it into a brutal play-by-play. Within an hour, Gibson vs. Dixon was trending at #1, overtaking every major news story of the day. Then came the reaction videos. Conservative commentators were already picking apart the interview, calling it a masterclass in exposing media hypocrisy. Clips circulated with freeze frames of Dixon's paling face, edited with dramatic zoom-ins and slow-motion replays of his worst moments. Even some left-leaning voices, the ones who normally wouldn't touch a story like this, had to acknowledge it. "Look, I don't like the guy, but damn, that was brutal." The mainstream media scrambled to contain the damage, but they had no unified angle. Some outlets tried the Mel Gibson plays the victim narrative, but it didn't land, because the full interview was out and people had seen what actually happened. Others went for a tense exchange with controversial star, trying to play it neutral, but even that wasn't enough to shift the conversation. The internet had already decided who won. By the next morning, late-night comedians were doing their best to spin it, mocking the moment, cutting it down to sound bites they could control. But the real story wasn't happening on television, it was happening online. Memes flooded Reddit and Instagram, comparing Dixon's meltdown to famous on-air disasters. "This is CNN's version of the Hindenburg," one post read. Another simply showed a photo of Dixon's stunned face with the caption, "Sir, you just lost to Mel Gibson." Thoughts. And then came the fallout. Sponsors of Dixon's show started getting flooded with emails and tweets demanding to know if they stood behind media manipulation. One brand quietly pulled their advertisements within 24 hours. Another issued a non-committal statement about reevaluating partnerships. Dixon himself stayed quiet at first. No damage control statement, no tweets, nothing. He knew anything he said would just be ammunition, but silence was a mistake too. Because in the vacuum, the internet filled in the blanks. Someone unearthed an old interview where he'd contradicted himself on the very issues he tried to corner me on. Others started digging deeper into his past takes, his past hypocrisy. It was all unraveling, and there wasn't a single move he could make to stop it. By the end of the week, his show's ratings had plummeted. Viewership was down nearly 40%. His producers were in full panic mode, executives scrambling for a way to course correct. But there was no undoing what had happened. As for me, I didn't post a single thing, no victory lap, no response, nothing. I didn't have to. The internet was doing all the talking for me.